Hey, folks, we've got a great episode lined up for you today with Mark Meriaux of the Natural Stone Institute. We're going to talk primarily about silicosis, then some about safety in general. We're going to cover some of what's been happening with silicosis, get you up to date on the current status of what's going on in California and around the country, and also talk about some practical ways that you can address the issues in your facility. So listen up. This one covers a lot of ground. We cover it pretty quickly, and it takes a little while, but it's definitely worth a listen. Thanks. Folks, really happy to have Mark Meriaux of the Natural Stone Institute with us today. Mark, welcome. Thanks for taking some time to talk with us about safety today.
Thanks, Ed. It's been an ongoing issue for us, and I'm excited to talk with you today about it.
Your position at NSI is Accreditation and Technical Manager. Can you tell us a little bit about what that involves, and then also maybe give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of your background before NSI?
Yeah, so those of you who see me live, I usually joke and say I'm a recovering fabricator. I started in the stone industry in early 2000s, I think 2001, 2002, when I started a small shop here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live, and with a partner from college, and we both had careers in other industries, engineering backgrounds, education wise. But we were both looking for something different, and we started a small shop, primarily processing blanks for countertops. We outgrew that model very quickly, and we're into slab work and full custom countertops within the 6 months of starting that. That company was one of the victims of the 2008 economic slowdown. I made some decisions. We had built a nice, beautiful new building, and I bought out my partner with funds that I didn't have long term. Took the business over myself, and right about the time that business halted for us,
Ouch.
construction wise. A lot of people in the industry saw that, but
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough in those 7 years to build some relationships already with other local competitors, and had other opportunities open up quickly. And I stayed in the industry working in other roles in fabrication and sales and project management for subsequently larger companies. And then about 8 years ago, I think June will be 8 years at the Institute, I was able to join the Natural Stone Institute staff. And as we get older, lifting and working in the shop is not as appealing as it was when I was younger, being creative with the stone. But I feel that my experience and my expertise is good. Better spent now trying to educate those, keep them from making some of the mistakes I did and other ones I learned about from around the industry.
So is that kind of the focus of Accreditation and Technical Manager, is educating folks, or?
Well, I wear a few hats at the Institute. So I work both within our technical department to a limited degree, which is Chuck Muehlbauer is our technical director. We have a stone testing lab up in Ohio. I have limited input in there. Scott Scalorn is our lab manager there. We do a lot of testing for our industry colleagues and members, for project-based and just stone-based for our Quarrier members. But then I also work with our education team, putting together educational resources that benefit the entire industry. A lot of that more countertop focused in what I touch on. So when I joined the Institute, Chuck was glad, because his expertise is more exterior cladding and very technical commercial applications, where mine's the interior architectural finishes. So he was glad to, as a technical resource, be able to hand off a lot of those member inquiries to me with my experience and background. So, but yeah, that's one of the member services we offer. Accreditation is a credentialing program that we have for contractors and installers of natural stone. So it's a third-party credential or verification of business practices, technical competency, and general business practices. And we actually go in and review the companies before they can earn the accreditation. There's a 4-hour exam. It's part of that. Number of steps involved in earning accreditation. We've got a couple companies that are actively pursuing that this year. We seem to add about 3 or 4 each year now. It's a fairly not challenging, but it's very involved to attain the accreditation. qualifications, but then once they become it's the only thing close to any licensure we have for contractors in our industry. We don't have a formal licensure program outside of like a contractor's license in states like California, but it's the only third-party verification for installers and fabricators of natural stone. So
And
that's
then
what
it,
accreditation is. Yeah, it's one of the programs I lead. And then like I said, I serve on our technical committee, so we provide technical support to our members, and then I work with our education team. Like we saw each other last week, both trying to educate all the fabricators out there, give them best practices, both for their businesses and safety, and making them more profitable and safer places.
and that's why we're here. And especially while we're talking today, going back to accreditation, the shop that I ran, the owner was one of I think he was like the second or third company to be accredited with NSI. It was Solid Tops, Evan Kruger.
Yep.
He was really a big proponent of that. And I think in an industry that doesn't have a lot of standards, even though NSI has got a lot of good technical information out there, there's not any licensure. There's we don't come under a lot of the typical electrical, home builder, general contractor type standards. In a lot of ways, we kind of fall through the cracks. So I think this accreditation is a great opportunity for a fab shop to kind of set themselves apart. If they're looking for a competitive edge, it's certainly attainable. You guys have got some great resources to help with that. And I think it's something that the shops really ought to consider. So I think I hadn't really planned on talking about that, but I think it's a great plug for that program.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate that. Yeah, Solid Tops has been in there a while, and I'm glad Evan and his crew were early adopters on that back in 2008-ish. I mean, the shops I worked at, back then, one of them, we actually were pursuing accreditation before they stopped fabricating stone entirely. It was a big manufacturing organization, but so I've been involved in it both from a member side and now on the association side in managing that program. So I also leading into, I know a topic we're going to get into in depth here. I also manage our two safety committees. We have one just for general safety for the industry, and then our quarrier members have a specific one for quarry safety.
Great. That's good to hear. Yeah, I think you're talking about some of the commercial work that one of the other folks in the lab kind of focuses on and has history in. You're talking about quarries. NSI really runs the gamut of not just countertops, but really all of natural stone. And I don't want to get into everything that you guys do, but it's just, it is, in my opinion, the premier membership organization in this industry. And it is, you guys have got some great resources, some of which we're going to talk about as we get into the topic of safety and more specifically into the topic of silicosis.
Well, let's get started.
Okay. No, enough of this fixing to. Let's do it. I got you. Silicosis obviously is front and center in a lot of people's minds these days. There's been a lot of, I stalk a lot of groups on Facebook just to kind of keep my fingers on the pulse of the industry. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there, a lot of misinformation. And part of what I'd like to do today is kind of quickly walk through and clear a lot of that stuff up. Quartz is the big bugaboo in the silicosis front. We've heard that Australia has banned it, and that they banned the import and the fabrication, and that's all going into effect, I think, July 1. But then there's also some challenges for what about existing contracts, commercial contracts inspected? What about all the inventory we've got? So they're struggling with that. I've heard, read some articles that say that New Zealand should be pretty close behind them and doing the same type of thing. And then I think pretty much everybody has heard, unless you're living under a rock, that LA County came close to banning it, but backed off of it. And my understanding is NSI was heavily involved in helping educate the folks making that decision to understand what's really going on in the industry. Can you tell us a little bit about what the status is with LA County and what NSI's involvement was?
Yeah, so a little background. First of all, Australia as a countertop industry was primarily a quartz-based industry. I think as a country, they produced and cut a lot more quartz slab products than they did any natural stone or porcelain, things like that. And then second to that, both in Australia and California, all the headlines, all of the news articles, and all the information driving the major concern with silicosis came from initial health cases showing up in hospitals. So the doctors, the pulmonologists in the medical hospitals, they have a network and they communicate anonymously the caseloads of cases like lung diseases that show up, and they were seeing an odd spike or an unusual spike in the number of lung cases showing up in hospitals, not just in California, but Washington State, Texas, Colorado, many states. And so these pulmonologists got together and they said, they started asking these patients more questions about where they were working, what types of activities they were doing. And just from some simple question and answers, they came to the conclusion that all these workers were in countertop-based industries, and they were all heavily working with engineered or artificial stone. So that was where that initial conclusion came from. They said, well, it must be the artificial stone that's causing all this, because we know stone's been around, natural stone's been around forever. We've never seen the cases like this appearing in the hospitals. So that's kind of what the impetus was for the decisions that were made both in Australia and California. In Australia, because it was just such a quartz-based land, and the enforcement, the equivalent of OSHA or the safety organizations in Australia, weren't unable to affect major change or understanding of the workers enough to cause them to implement a lot of the safety protocols that we're preaching here in the US to try and keep everybody safe. So the only method they saw that would be effective at keeping workers safe was to ban the product. And that's ultimately what happened in Australia. And yeah, you mentioned it, but July 1's their deadline there. But they still have some unanswered questions, like you mentioned, what to do with all of the quartz-based product landed that's sitting in Australia in warehouses or fabrication facilities, unfabricated. And then what about the legal ramifications of contracts that have yet to be fulfilled on construction projects where those products are specified? So the Australian folks are working through those details now. And I don't know or want to try to predict what the outcome will be there. But what I do know is what's happened in California. So initially, the legislators in California wanted to propose a similar ban. They realized the economic impact would be a little different in California, that there's a heavier mixture of products being fabricated for countertops. And they also, with some information, understood that it's not just a single product that could be causing this issue. It's a lot to do with the fabrication methods and the lack of safety protocols that's causing the silicosis cases in the hospitals.
Yeah, and so I think one of the information, let me back up, at coverings last week, you guys, you and Jim had a really good presentation, kind of giving an update on what's happening in the industry and what's going on with silicosis. And I thought one of the interesting slides that you showed was a chart that showed the silica content of pretty much all the materials used in countertops. I think we've set you up for a screen share. Have you got that up where you can share that with us?
Yeah, hopefully you can see that now. This is a chart that was put together by NIOSH back in 2014. So the current OSHA silica regulations were passed and became legal back in 2016, and they had kind of a stair step of requirements that went into full effect over 2 years. But the current federal standards have been in full effect since 2018 and enforceable. But part of the engineering and research they did in coming up with those 2016 federal rules involved this type of information, like I said, that NIOSH compiled, showing that, engineered or manufactured products for years have been claiming, over 93% by weight of quartz or silica, the same mineral. But being in natural stone industry, I also understand that natural quartzite and quartzitic sandstone are nearly pure silica or pure silica quartz. So they could present a similar risk if they're not fabricated safely or correctly. Other concerns include granites, which can have a range of silica in them, but this is just one of the concerns when understanding where the risk starts, is what products are you cutting what products, yeah, what's the makeup of the products going through your shop and what protocols you have in place to minimize the exposure to the airborne silica.
Yeah, one of the things this chart shows is, with quartzite is about a 95% silica content. If Australia, for example, since they've banned the quartz, a man-made, engineered stone product, and all of a sudden the people really get hot about quartzite, and quartzites have been popular because of their look and feel a lot lately. If, for example, they started importing a whole lot of quartzite for countertops, they really haven't solved their problem.
Absolutely.
It really is about how you process your materials. And let's walk down through the chart and hit the rest of these real quick. We've got engineered stone at about 93% silica, quartzite at 95%, quartzitic sandstone at 90%, sandstone itself, which is a little bit of sandstone in countertops. It's usually used in other building materials, but that's 60%. Granite, as you said, can vary from 10 to 45%. And slate and soapstone can still have some silica in it, but it varies depending on what specific product you're looking at.
Absolutely. And the only natural stones not mentioned in this chart are marbles, limestones, and travertines, those calcareous based materials, because some of them may have very, very small amounts of silica in those in some of the veins, but it's nearly inconsequential when concerned from a safety or processing standpoint.
And also to be clear, I mean, this podcast is directed at folks in the industry, but in case a consumer will be listening to this, the concern is the processing of these materials, the silica that's released, the respirable silica that's out there, the impact on the workers. Once this product is in a home, there is no issue, unless you start sawing on or chipping on your countertops yourself, which would be crazy. You're going to do your own remodel and ripping them out, and you do something, you could have some silica released. It's not going to be, probably be minimal, but in general, if you're just using countertops in your house, there is no issue.
Yeah, for consumers who might listen in, it is strictly a worker issue. It's people who cut, grind, drill, sand or finish countertops, anything that might cause or create dust out of that material.
Okay.
And it's not even the dust you see. So the critical dust that actually causes the damage within the lungs is nearly invisible. It's very, very small crystalline silica particulates that go deep into the lungs and ultimately cause your body can't break down that silica mineral. So ultimately your lungs scar over, you lose breathing capacity, and the only cure for silica-based, pneumoconiasis, I think is the is a lung transplant ultimately. So the young, and the other thing doctors were noticing was the youthfulness, the age of these workers coming in. They were mainly between the ages of 30 and 45. They're fairly young, and some of them had what you and I would consider short careers in the stone industry, fewer than 5 years doing that job, and they were coming down with these illnesses. So it is a serious concern.
And I think it's important too to kind of put this in some perspective. I cut my teeth in the textile industry early on in my career. And so, the big issue when I was in textiles was brown lung, cotton dust, and all the testing and all that went on there. And we're starting to see the same type of reaction here. And of course, a lot of folks, younger folks may not remember, but folks our age certainly remember black lung, folks working in coal mines having similar issues. So it's not something, the silica issue specifically is unique to this industry, but the idea of having something in your work environment that impacts your health and can kill you, and over a period, because the effects accumulate over time is not new. And going in and doing some of the things we're going to talk about for how you address it, those are not new necessarily either, new to our industry, but it's not an unusual circumstance. It's part of what you have to do when you discover, wait a minute, we've got a problem, we have to address it.
Yep. And so we've, over the last 5 to 7 years, we put together a number of these resources based on the federal OSHA silica rules, the standards that are in place as of 2016. We put together some education back in 2016, 2017, which kind of went over the background and basis of the current standards federally. And then we last year did a major overhaul or update of those educational resources. We had a number of courses. It started out over 8 or 9 hours. We went through and did we wrote out the transcripts with just the details that were needed, had professional voiceovers done, shortened a lot of that education. So now we've got a certificate available, a training certificate available that involves general OSHA compliances, best practices, silica safety, understanding and best practices. And then we also included safe slab handling, which we've had for a number of years. But I personally, and we as an organization, felt that that has to be part of it. We know silica is the headline right now. That's what everybody wants and thinks they need. But the unfortunate reality is that every month I get another email of a fatality of a worker in our industry that was killed or severely injured by a slab handling incident. Seems to be on average about 10 workers a year. That these are just the reports that I hear of, the headlines. So before the silica issue rose to the top, slab handling and slab, stone handling deaths were probably the primary cause of major incidents or accidents in our industry. So we felt that this is our one chance to get everybody on one page and educated and up to speed on best practices. We ought to have it all packaged together in one place.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that several things. One is, one of the things NSI is known for is the depth and breadth and quality of the safety resources that you've got. And there's, toolbox talks, there's all sorts of videos. And we talked about the accreditation for fabrication in general, but I think, if you're a shop that is selling a lot of quartz and you're getting questions from your customers about quartz, if you've got an NSI, if you're an NSI accredited shop and you've got the silicosis certificate as well, and you're displaying those in your showroom and on your website, then when you talk to a customer about this, you've automatically got more authority than the guys down the street that don't have any of that stuff. So I think it's a
Right.
great competitive edge. If you're serious about being a professional in this industry, those two things are things you ought to look at.
And so we have a number of shortened URLs that people can reach through our website. I will say, let me back up real quick. All of our safety resources are provided free of charge to the entire industry through generous donations from our general safety committee member companies. So they all collectively put up funding that helps us create and maintain all these resources. But one of the things that we do is, so every one of the courses in the Silica certificate, the education, the content is free to individuals. We do charge a $199 fee to non-NSI or non-Natural Stone Institute members who want to earn that certificate, just for the verification and validation so they can get that training credential, that's actual certificate. But all the content is available to any individual in the industry. They just have to create a login and start viewing or taking the courses online.
That's
And
fantastic.
That goes for all of our safety courses.
I think that's great. What's interesting about this industry, because I have worked in so many other industries prior to this one, I got in this industry about the same time you did, Mark, in the early 2000s. Not as an owner or an operator, but as a coach and consultant. And so it's been interesting watching over 20 years how quickly this industry has adapted. It's an old industry in that, making things out of stone has been around since the Stone Age, obviously, but it's relatively new in the concept of stone countertops of some form or fashion being in a lot of people's homes. It used to be just for wealthy people.
Yeah.
About 20, 30 years ago, it became more accessible and available to a lot more people. And in the last, I'd say 10 or 15 years since the recession's been over with, it's really become much more prevalent and in a lot more competition. Of course, a lot of folks listening to this podcast are feeling the effects of that competition, but we've come up the curve a lot in technology and in visibility and a lot of things that we do in our shops. I think one area that we're still lacking as an industry is in the professional level of our management teams and the way we approach our businesses. And I think safety is a good indication of that. And I think, to me, silicosis is the beginning of improving all of that for this industry. There are a lot of other issues we can get into. Before we do that, though, I want to step back. Australia attacked this issue of silicosis by banning a product. The one that was the most visible, easy to recognize product. They didn't necessarily solve the root cause. They didn't solve the problem. LA County, through I think a lot of help from NSI, started to understand what the real issue was. It was the content of the silicosis content in the materials, and it was the way that the materials processed in the shop that was causing the problem. It wasn't that it was a particular product. So LA's County has been a bit different approach than Australia. They've focused more on processes, procedures, measuring respiratory, what is it? The correct
RCS, respirable crystalline silica. So that airborne particulate, there's
Yeah.
a method for measuring and monitoring that in the general environment. So, so what California did was Cal OSHA was looking for a better way to enforce that. And so we were invited. We were at the early discussions with them. They had some rough drafts of what they currently have in place now is what they call an ETS, or Emergency Technical Standards. So everything I've been talking about up till now is federal OSHA, the 2016 rules that are fully in effect in all 50 states around the U.S. But then in California, they deemed that the federal OSHA silica standards weren't effective enough in the state of California, and so they created more diligent or more. They added some more rules within the state of California called Emergency Temporary Standard. That was passed and went into effect in December of 2023, and that will be in effect for the next 12 months through 2024, at which time my understanding is that they will have a permanent California regulations in place that preclude or the federal standards. So things that they included on their emergency, and we affected, I think we counted 17 small changes to that emergency temporary standard. It's still not ideal. If I owned a fab shop in California, I still wouldn't be happy with having to comply with the rules of the ETS. But some of the thing on the enforcement side, one major thing they added that was helpful for Cal OSHA to be able to enforce was a zero dry fabrication rule. So no dry cutting, no dry fabrication. So previous to that, they described to us the process when an enforcement officer went into a shop. Even if they saw somebody cutting dry, even if they were coated and covered with dust from fabrication, the OSHA officer had to put the little air monitors, the sampling pups, on the employees in the area and monitor them for 6 to 8 hours to prove that the exposure was beyond the limit for OSHA to be enforceable before they could write any citations or affect any change for those workers. So that was very challenging for them. It was lengthy in time, and if you can imagine a fab shop, you have an OSHA guy come there and put monitors on you. An easy way to affect the results of that air monitoring is to change your work habits immediately. Either stop working for 8 hours or do different tasks or work on marble for the next, something with very low silica content for the next while. Change your job habits.
Yeah.
That was a complaint that OSHA had. So we were very in favor of their zero dry cutting rule in California. So now when they go into a shop, if they see this dry cutting occurring, they can issue a stop work order immediately and start protecting the health of those workers. Other things that we're not so happy with was they defaulted to requiring respirators for every stone worker in the state of California, every fabricator in the state of California, not just a half-face respirator, but a fairly expensive, what they call a PAPR, a powered air purifying respirator, PAPR, which involves a filtration pump pack that usually goes on the belt of the employee with a hose going up to a full over the face, forehead to chin, over the face shield for the supplied. So they have supplied clean air coming up into their entire face, and they have to work with that the entire time.
And that's still in the emergency.
That's in the emergency rule, and that requirement is regardless of any air monitoring data that shop may have.
Is this just LA County or is this California statewide?
California statewide.
Okay.
So we have members there that had been proactively doing air monitoring and putting, engineering controls, whether that's all wet methods, housekeeping efforts, some of these large filtration walls, suction devices to keep the air clean in their shops and keep that particulate out of the air, those contaminants out of the air. They've invested heavily in that. But OSHA's new standard, or Cal OSHA, excuse me, the emergency standard requires every employee in every shop to be wearing those respirators. And now that you have respirators in place, now you have to have a respiratory protection program in place, which is another set
Yeah.
of training and maintenance requirements for those devices that has to be in place. Another rule we weren't totally happy with, well, we are in part, is a requirement for all those workers to be medically surveilled. So in the federal OSHA rule, if the worker is exposed over action level, which is 25 micrograms in a shift for more than 30 days a year, they're supposed to be medically surveilled, which means chest x-rays, lung function exams, to monitor the health of that employee to make sure that they're staying safe during their career in the stone industry. That is now a requirement, again, for every employee in the state of California. The difficulty there is the shops that are complying. I mean, it's an expense, but the honest above board shops, the ones who are already doing the engineering controls, already doing, making the huge investments to keep their workers safe, now have these additional expenses and additional medical protocols that they have to comply with. And the non-compliant shops feasibly just won't do that. So they'll have a pricing, a competitive advantage by not spending all that, not having those expenses of the respirators, not having the expenses of the medical testing, and they'll continue to duck and hide and try to avoid OSHA wherever they can. Cal OSHA, that is.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a challenge in this industry on all levels. What I refer to as the two guys in a pickup truck working out of a rental unit somewhere. They show up at your house, set up sawhorses in your driveway, and they start making your countertop, fabricating your countertop right there in your driveway. Well, we'll always have to fight that to some degree, and that's not unique to this industry. There's other industries I've been involved in. The regulations, typically it's what can the regulators adequately inspect? What can they identify, expect? How can they find them in terms of locating those folks? And somebody who's got a really low overhead and a low business presence can have the name of ABC countertops today, and tomorrow they're XYZ countertops. And so I think that's a challenge we're always going to have. But one of the questions I've seen pop up a lot on the medical monitoring is in California now, there's a requirement for an initial pulmonary evaluation, and then there's annual updates that are required too. Is that correct?
Yeah. So even with the federal OSHA, don't quote me verbatim, but I think it was a requirement of every 3 years if they were above that action level.
Yeah.
At a minimum. You could do it more often. California now requires a minimum of annual medical surveillance. Like I said, that includes a chest X-ray with a B reader evaluation, and the B reader is a pulmonologist qualification that they can look for things like silicosis symptoms on an X-ray. So that chest X-ray, B reader. Other good things to do would be a pulmonary function test, like lung spirometry, where somebody breathes into the hose to determine the volume of their lungs. Those types of things can pick up or notice changes in the health of that employee over a period of time. So we've always preached that that's a good practice that businesses nationwide should think about implementing right now, especially on new hires or at the start of especially if that employee has work or previous work at another shop where you don't know their safety protocols or safety practices. So that new employee that may be new to you starting may have some existing conditions, and unless you have that medical surveillance or medical information determined by a health professional, you can't assume that they're healthy.
Exactly. And it's the same thing again we had in textiles, both on breathing and on hearing. You couldn't walk in a textile plant to
Oh,
clock
yes.
in without having earplugs in. I mean, because
Sure.
it's noisy. And the whole time I worked there, you start off with a hearing test on day one, and then every year you had an update. They want to track your trends, and then did the same thing with pulmonary function. Even though we didn't always work in areas that had cotton dust, there are lots of engineering controls in place. We had
Sure.
to do that annual stuff, and so I think the recommendation for a shop owner now that's hiring somebody with industry experience, get that baseline pulmonary examination, get that baseline data, and then do the updates. And part of this is because of liability. There is the question of, does a shop's insurance automatically cover silicosis?
So no. Talk to your insurance agent. I'm not an agent or a insurance advisor. So preclude everything I say here by saying talk to your agent, ask about it. But there are
Always.
silica exclusions on most general workman's comp policies. So, um, which includes both um, claims against your employees and customers. So if you were created dust on a job site or in a home, the customer may claim illness or you know
Yeah.
against you. But unless you have that supplemental policy, it covers things like silica, asbestos, mold, a bunch of these airborne disturbances or airborne contaminants policy.
So the recommendation for shop owner is, once you finish this podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube, go call your insurance agent and make sure you're covered. Because
Yeah.
it's a liability issue. When you look at the issue of safety in general, there's a few aspects to it. One is somebody gets hurt, somebody gets silicosis, somebody gets hurt handling a slab, gets killed, God forbid. That's a big liability issue for the company, and those issues can kill a company. You can get shut down depending on how big the fines are and what your financial health is, and those types of things. And I don't get morose about it, but I mean, that's certainly a liability. So safety from one aspect is avoiding that liability. And the other aspect is, we have all been struggling. The number one topic that pops up all the time when I talk to shop owners is trying to find good people. Well, if you've got good people on staff, why do you want to not keep them healthy?
Right.
Why would you want them to get sick or get hurt or anything else? Safety helps take those critical skill sets that you've invested so much time and effort in and keeps them healthy so they can continue to perform, not just for the health of the business, but for their own personal well-being as well. I've never met a shop owner that intentionally or just didn't care that somebody went home at the end of the day hurt. And, you don't see that I never have. So I think those are both aspects of safety mindset in general, and part of what's got to be looked at from a safety program standpoint. I think that's something that, not that we don't care in this industry, we just haven't had to face it much. And so now it's time to start getting a little more organized, a little more professional, put some things in place. And one of the questions I get a lot is, okay, I'm not a dry shop. Everything I do is wet. Am I okay as far as silicosis goes?
Everything we've learned, and a lot of this is gathered from firsthand data that's been shared with me by NSI member companies, the ones who are taking those proactive measures. So obviously, wet cutting is probably the single most effective way to keep airborne particulates or contaminants out of the air. Keeping that water directed at the cutting point of the cutting tool, whether that's grinding, polishing, CNC, having that water fed equipment is instrumental at keeping that dust out of the air. But it doesn't guarantee that there's no breathable or respirable crystalline exposure. So the only way to really truly know that, and again, we've been preaching this since the federal standard went into effect back in 2016, is to have air monitoring or air sampling done. Back then, and there's multiple ways companies can do that. So, the one we've been recommending the most is working with the state consultative divisions. It's funded under the federal OSHA umbrella, but in most states, it's run by a separate office, usually through the Department of Labor within that state. Some states, like where I live here in Georgia, it's through a state technical college or university that manages that. But it's a free resource to small business owners. They can have consultants come in and do a complete look at your overall safety program, or you can invite them in just to do to serve specific needs, and look at things like air monitoring for silica exposure or the hearing tests, things like that. They have industrial hygienists on staff. And I'll back up again because you mentioned the labor shortage in our workforce. And earlier than that, you mentioned a inability to enforce or implement change on the enforcement side. So in California specifically, they have a very large vacancy rate in the OSHA pool of workers, their agents, their enforcement, their rule makers. So they're hiring if anybody's interested in moving to California and working for Cal OSHA. But also that just points out that they're kind of shorthanded too on both the enforcement side and the consultative side. So both sides of that are. So on the consultative side, of note, even those companies in California and other states, I'm hearing some of this too, where they have shortages or backlogs of requests. So the state consultative program starts from the moment you have to formally request a consultation through the state. The only obligation to the employer or the company is to correct any deficiencies they find during that consultation. And they're usually not major. And they also provide consultative services on how to correct those hazards, whatever they find. They'll give you advice, whether it's training resources, paperwork, record keeping, all of those. They'll provide help and additional resources to get you up to speed with a comprehensive safety program. And then even with RCS exposure, they'll give you some advice on things you can do. But in the shop, since you mentioned all wet, wet cutting is number one. That's the thing I would recommend to everybody. Go to all wet processes. I understand that there's still shops that laminate and do things where they have to have pieces dry at certain points of the process. I will say that I've been to shops that are 100% wet. They have a drying process in between those gluing or laminations. There is no process now that you cannot do wet, to my knowledge. So I would implore or ask every shop to consider going 100% wet. The additional steps that we've seen improvements make involve things like regular wash downs. So not just at the beginning or end of shift hosing all the floor down, but imagine a day's worth of work. Once you go home for that night, that puddle of slurry dries overnight, and then you come in the next day, walk through that dried cake of slurry, kick that dust back up into the air. So what we're seeing that is effective is multiple wash downs during a day. So the guy at the saw will be constantly washing that slurry into a collection pit or into a filtration system, or before and leaving to and returning from breaks like lunch, hosing down, squeegeeing that floor down, getting that stuff out of the floor, off the floor. Because in some shops we've had people put the monitors on workers like forklift drivers, and they come up with some of the higher exposures just from driving out on graveled lots or out in yards where silica can be in the air, or just driving that forklift through those dried patches of slurry. So getting it into a collection system, keeping it out of the air, is a second thing you can do. Third, beyond that, if companies are getting close to or below Pell and trying to get below that action level, other things they can do is put in some general filtration, HEPA filtration, air circulators that constantly filter and circulate the air in the shop to pull that last little bit of dust out of the air.
Okay, so short answer is cutting wet is not necessarily sufficient. It is a first step.
The short answer is you don't know.
Yeah, until you test.
It's a great first step, but you don't know if it's effective until you measure it.
Right. And I think that's where some of the confusion I've seen on some of the Facebook groups has been that some people will say, well, one state has a tighter standard than another. Now, the standard is the standard. California, they haven't changed the PEL limits, have they?
No, the PEL is still 50 micrograms and the action level is still 25 micrograms. But even in shops where they have air monitoring below action level, which federally relieves companies of a lot of additional requirements like the medical surveillance. The respirators are not required when companies can regularly achieve below action level federally. But in California, they require those respirators regardless of air
Right.
monitoring data that they may have.
But what I was going to say was, I think some of the confusion over other states other than California that have, some people say, well, okay, my state has a different exposure limit level than other states. It's not that they don't necessarily have a different limit. They have, when you go to do you may be a wet shop, you do your testing, and because of some of the things that you mentioned, find out, okay, what we're doing is not enough, and therefore our people are over the limit. And it's
Yeah,
not that there was a different limit, it's just that your shop wasn't necessarily where it needed to be. And so testing is the gold standard. It's what you have to do. Going through the OSHA consultative assistance can be great there. I think that kind of leads us into this topic of safety in general. You know, silicosis is the big issue right now. Lots of press, lots of attention on it. But I think once shop owners start looking critically at their operations and looking at safety in general, and if they let the consultative services of OSHA come in their state and do just a general safety assessment, I think there could be lots of other issues that we're going to have to start looking at in this industry. What comes to my mind is lifting standards, and not so
yep,
much in the shop because we've got cranes, forklifts, things like that, but at an install, it's going to be, I think, it will be a big issue there. Talking about forklifts. I know from my experience in other industries, OSHA does not like forklift traffic mingled with people traffic. Uh,
right.
and so I walk into shops that don't have overhead cranes and move everything by forklift. And I know shop configuration sometimes prevents that, but again, those are things we've got to look at. Trip hazards, electrical cords in wet areas, just extension cords in general.
Yeah, GFCIs, all that, all electrical use, power, lockout, tag out, all of those
Oh
things,
man.
hazardous communication, SDS sheets, all of those things. So a couple tools I mentioned, we have that training certificate available. We call it the Silica and Safe Slab Handling Certificate, but it also covers general OSHA compliance. And there's some tools and resources during that training that folks can download. It's also available on our website. So I'm going to rattle off some of our shortened URLs. They're all naturalstoneinstitute.org/ safety is our main safety page. So naturalstoneinstitute.org/ silica is a silica specific safety page, and news and updates, things like that. But for the safety certificate, we have a shortened URL, naturalstoneinstitute.org/ safety certificate altogether. That'll get you to those core group of courses. And in that general OSHA compliance, one of the courses is understanding an OSHA inspection, the process that it goes through. And there's even a tool we've put together in an OSHA inspection planning checklist that companies can download. Again, that's on our safety page, our Silica page, but it's a resource that companies can download. Use that as for a self audit to kind of do your own walkthrough before you invite any of these consultants in, private or state or otherwise. So it's there. We have some useful tools on general compliance, obviously the webinars and stuff we've learned about silica safety. But I agree with you, slab handling, slab storage, all of these are instances that pop up from time to time, especially when those major fatalities or incidents occur. Then I get calls from OSHA officers in regions. Hey, do you have any guidance or standards for this? And so those are down the road, other topics that our safety committee is looking at for creating and creating some voluntary safety resources for the industry on best practices, so that if there's not one in place, the other potential outcome is that OSHA puts guidelines in place like Cal OSHA did with their ETS, that are more stringent or may present some challenges to shops that you may not have today. So we believe that we're able to, with our strong understanding of the industry, how shops run, how shops work, recommend best practices that are both efficient, economical, but also effective at keeping workers safe.
Well, I think that's what's so great about NSI is that you've got so many resources out there to help a shop owner who gets serious about this to start to figure out, okay, how do I put together an effective program that doesn't break the bank? What are the basic things that I need to do? How do I educate my people? I helped a client hire a sales manager from outside the industry just in the last few weeks, and I had just started working with this client and knew they didn't have a safety program. So the first thing I did is went to NSI's website, picked a handful of videos. I felt like, okay, these are the critical ones. I want somebody who doesn't know this industry to understand silicosis, slab handling, PPE, those, and then you've got one on slab handling for customers as well. And if you got a salesperson and customers, well, they need to understand, what to be aware of. So easy to pull that together with just an hour's worth of work and put that, get that done. So anybody who wants to do this, there's a lot of good resources out there for NSI for you. One of the things I think NSI did is when LA County started to get a bone in their teeth about this whole issue, and they wanted to maybe follow Australia's lead and just ban products. You guys got involved. You helped them understand what's really going on in the industry. And right now, I think you guys have got a survey initiative out there trying to collect some information to help educate national OSHA about what this industry is really like. It's not always, two guys in a pickup truck on a couple of sawhorses working in your driveway. It's much more sophisticated than that.
Right. Like I mentioned, the initial push for industry safety was coming based from input on the medical community and some of the enforcement data from Cal OSHA on enforcement throughout the state, where they had data from air sampling they had done in shops that had a number of facilities they had visited that did have alarmingly high exposures for those employees. But based on that information, that's where they put these very, very stringent and additional rules in place in the emergency temporary standard. So one thing we didn't have prepared at the time was a broader view of hard data from the industry to be able to show what the effectiveness is of basic safety protocols, like I mentioned, the wet cutting, the housekeeping efforts, and then the additional engineering controls or filtration that can be employed. So I'm going to put it on screen for the folks who are watching this live on the video. Let me figure out how to do that again. Share screen. So there is a QR code here. It should pop up now. So those who are watching this video version can see that. And it says May 1st deadline on here. We're extending that through the month of May. So this is a survey we put together with third parties. So medical professionals and scientists from Yale University we've hired. We've raised a lot of money to be able to do this. It's not cheap. But this is a survey they've put together to gather information across the broader industry across the U.S. on what fabrication facilities are doing. So some of the practices, the cutting methods, whether it's hand fab or CNC based, what type of engineering controls are in place, whether it's filters or all wet cutting. And then there's an opportunity in this survey towards the end where if the shops have conducted air sampling and have the full report data, there's an opportunity to upload that and share that anonymously so that Yale can compile all of those reports and get a broader view of the entire industry on where, which steps, which processes are most effective. And so we can make further recommendations. And also we can use that information when we communicate with the health officials, when we communicate with the regulators in states like California and federal OSHA, when they consider new or revised enforcement standards, we can give them this information and show them, the effectiveness that our industry can make with engineering controls, housekeeping practice, some basic things that can prove to be effective. And we hope the outcome is to prove that we can keep workers safe through some of those basic practices and protocols and not require every worker to be fitted with a bulky respirator for the entire time.
Yeah, bulky, expensive
Yeah.
Piece of equipment that's going to require additional programs, documentation, training, and everything else to work with that as well. So this
we
is
have,
a
we have a hopeful outcome, but I don't have an expectation on that outcome. Yale is
Yeah.
doing this completely, autonomously, gathering all that information, and they're also reviewing a lot of the current research, both medical research and product research regarding silica and silica containing materials. And we hope that, and one of the things we've asked them to do is to put out a best practices suggestion sheet at the end of this research study, so they can provide us with a better look. It's not just us and what we think. This is the medical professionals with Yale and pulmonologists and industrial hygienists with Yale that are looking at all of this data and giving us a broader guidance or guidelines for this. I do want to mention, so for those viewing this, we've got a QR code on screen. You can scan and take the survey. Through the month of May, we will have it also on our Silica webpage. Again, naturalstoneinstitute.org/silica. And right up at the top of the page, front and center, is a box with a link to participate in this survey. So I would implore or ask anyone watching or listening to this podcast, visit our Silica page and take that survey. Even if you don't have that air sampling data, but especially if you do, we'd love for you to share that information with us so that Yale has a realistic outlook of what our industry can and does look like.
And we'll put that link in the podcast description. And if you're on any of the Facebook groups, there's several organizations who have picked up what we just showed on screen and reposted it on Facebook. So there are lots of places you can access this. I want to emphasize that this is all confidential. Any information that you provide, and if you stop and think about it, when you start talking about professors and educators and regulators and government offices and physicians and people like that, they're not going to get out and be in our shops. They don't know what's going on. And so providing this information, I think, really helps give them an honest, accurate picture of what is already being done for a multitude of reasons, not just for safety, out in the industry, and helps them understand what's really happening, so they don't have some alternate view that's based on what they read about Australia or what they've maybe read in some publications somewhere that are trying to sensationalize things a little bit, not providing an accurate picture. This is our chance to show everybody else what we're already doing and what's really happening. And so I think it's really important. Take a few minutes. This is about a 10 or 15 minute exercise to fill this out.
Yeah, I think it's 5 to 10 minutes for the basic questions, and then if you have the air sampling data, either electronically or scanning and uploading it, that may be the lengthiest portion of it for some shops that have that information.
Yeah, to grab a photocopy with a copy with your phone and then just upload it and do that. So anybody who's listening, if you take a few minutes and do this, it's just going to help the industry out, and that's why we have these podcasts. That's why NSI has put the effort that they have. In fact, my understanding is you guys have suspended some other initiatives you had underway just to apply more people and more resources to this whole silicosis and safety issue. I know there's a committee that I was involved in that has suspended work for a while because Aaron and some others have just been tied up helping out with this issue.
No, we're incredible workhorses, and we haven't stopped anything. We're keep doing everything, and this is just another one on top of that. But this has been a primary issue for us for longer than, but at least the last 6 to 8 months. Jim and I have been heavily involved, and we continue to be involved. Like I said, we're still working and talking with regulators in California. Now there are legislation in place that's being proposed in California. I didn't mention that. So these are all outcomes and I know everybody's watching California, what's happening in California, because what happens there has a potential to migrate into other states or across the U.S. But one of the things they're looking at through legislation is control or chain of custody for materials that contain silica. So we believe that could be an effective method, and most of the major distributors that we've talked with are on board with this, is only selling the silica containing materials to shops that have undergone a certain level of training or credentialing or licensure, however you want to say it, So there would be a licensure component, registering with the state, a certain level of training and safety protocols in place. But then there also would be some chain of custody information handling on the distributors to make sure that they're only selling to people who are legally allowed to buy and process these materials. So that's another avenue. It's currently in process. And like I said, we're in the middle of those discussions. We're still working with California public health officials to give them a better understanding, a view of what our industry can and does look like in the safe shops, and hopefully give them a stronger understanding of what can be done when shops are proactive or businesses are proactive at keeping their workers safe, and we don't have to default at that last ditch effort. And the reason I say last ditch, because respirators only protect the single employee that's wearing it. They still may be creating dust that affects everyone around them. So we like the hierarchy of controls as determined by NIOSH from many decades ago, that simpler, more effective, keeping the contaminants out of the air in the first place is a more effective method of control. And we hope to show that with the data collection provided by your listeners and industry members around the country.
Okay. Super. And even though this has been probably a little bit longer than our normal podcast and YouTube video, I think it's necessary. I think it's critical in this industry. Quite frankly, if we don't all get involved and do things like filling out the survey and take advantage of the resources that are available, at some point somebody will do it for us.
Yep.
It's kind of like the old adage on preventive maintenance on your equipment. If you don't schedule your downtime for your equipment, your machine will do it for you at some point. And it's the same thing here. So we've got to be proactive, need to be involved. NSI's got some great resources. I'm sure even though we've covered a lot of ground today, there are probably going to be other questions. And other than hitting the NSI website, is there anybody they could call to ask questions? Anybody they could email, Mark?
Yeah, you can email me if it's safety related, specifically silica safety. So mark@naturalstoneinstitute.org. I think I said that correctly.
Yep.
I'm doing it fast now. But also to those companies who are not member companies, you can support financially through your membership. It's $1,000 a year that covers every employee in your organization, gives every employee access to resources like technical support, me and Chuck. Also all of our other programs, and our member companies get unlimited number of certificates, education wise, both for the safety resources and all of our other education online. And I just hope they'll at least consider supporting us through membership if you're not. And to our current members, I want to thank you all.
Well, it's a great resource, as we've said many times in this episode. And Mark, really appreciate all the work NSI has done for the industry. Appreciate your time today sharing all that with us. And again, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ed. Sorry about running so long, but I hope your viewers and listeners find it valuable, and I appreciate the time.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Folks, really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the conversation with Mark Meriaux. I hope you got a lot of really good information about the status of silicosis issue in the industry and some specific things that you can do as a fabricator to help protect those workers. You know, those folks you have a hard time really finding good ones. You like to keep the ones you've got. Let's keep them healthy. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. And until next time, happy fabricating.